If you will, be turning in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 15. Or if you want to, you can turn to Mark chapter 7 as well. But this miracle of study this morning is found in these two accounts, and we're going to tie them both together as we go through our study this morning, our discussion. In our study of the miracles of Jesus, we have seen several characteristics of what genuine faith in God is. And before we get into those, I first want to pose the question, what makes faith true or genuine? In your estimation, what are the marks of true faith in God? Action, that's a very astute observation and very correct observation, Rusty. Action. Yeah, that ties right in, Sister Ruby. And that's that's the principle we learned from the events in John chapter 2 when we studied about the wedding feast at Cana. Remember that Christ's mother told those there to listen to him and to do what he says. And we also learned about this principle in John chapter 9 with the blind man, that true faith is that which involves action. And that action is doing what man is told to by God, or as is required by God. What else do we learn about faith? What else constitutes genuine faith? Trust. And that's the opposite of what Peter manifested, was it not, in Matthew chapter 14 when he was walking on the sea? What happened there when Peter started out to Christ and he was walking on the sea? What happened when he took his eyes off Christ? He sunk. So what happened to Peter?
He lost sight. He lost his faith.
He lost sight. He lost his faith. He began to doubt. And that's why Paul exhorts us in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7 that we are to walk by what? And not by sight. Peter walked by sight. He initially walked by faith, but because of the storms and he took his eyes off Christ, he began to walk by sight, and as a result, he began to sink. And when we walk by sight, we sink spiritually, just as Peter sank physically. But we also learned, I want to add this as well, in last week's account, that from the centurion, that faith believes in the Word of God. It takes God at His Word. But today we want to add another characteristic of faith to our study. And I think one of the overriding characteristics that we need in our life and that we're going to see from the study today is that of persistence. What do we mean by persistence? How would you define persistence?
Keep on keeping on.
That's a simple explanation, but a very appropriate one, Rusty. Keep on keeping on. In other words, when times get tough, you don't give up, do you? You just press on. You just keep on keeping on, plugging away, as it were. It's like, sports teams. When you get into a slump, or especially in basketball, when a shooter gets into a shooting slump, what do you got to do? Does it mean you stop shooting?
Shoot out of it.
You shoot out of it. Sometimes it takes a while. And you got to keep on keeping on. Football teams, when they get, or any team that gets into a losing streak, you got to keep working at it. You got to keep on keeping on. You just don't sit back and say, well, this is too tough, so I'm giving up, do we? What happens if we just do that? What happens if we just say, I can't do it, and just decide to give up?
Then your enemy has won.
Then the enemy, that's exactly right, Rusty. The enemy has won. We need persistence, and really we need persistence in all walks of life. And so Rusty gives us a good working definition, keep on keeping on. Webster adds to that with the idea of persist as to continue steadily and firmly in the pursuit of any business or course commenced. Again, you just keep your eyes focused on what you're trying to accomplish. The idea of persistence, according to Webster, is the state of persisting, steady pursuit of what is undertaken. And again, you use the analogy of sports teams. Every year they begin a season, and before season they undergo preseason training. And every year, every team has a goal. And what's the goal of every team? Or what should the goal of every team be?
Go undefeated.
Go undefeated. Win a championship. Set goals high. But yet your goals are always attainable. When we obey the gospel and become Christians, what is our goal in this life? That's exactly right, Dusty. That sums it up in a nutshell. To live the Christian life, to die, so that we can go to heaven. Do we need persistence in living the Christian life? Oh, absolutely. And what are some ways we need to be persistent? Persistency in studying, 2 Timothy 2, verse 15. Attendance, worshiping God, persistently worship God. That's exactly right, Carolyn. Striving every day to live it. And that involves, striving to keep ourselves unspotted.
Seek and save the lost.
Exactly, persistency in evangelism. And again, and we especially need persistency in evangelism, because how many times have we ever been told, I don't want to hear it? You just got to keep on keeping on, plugging away. We need persistency in overcoming temptation, do we not? Temptation can be hard to bear. But yet Christ persistently defeated the devil there in Matthew chapter 4 by giving it is written, it is written, it is written. So how do we persistently overcome temptation in our lives? Is it not by using the same method that Christ did, the Scriptures, and making the proper application? What about prayer? Do we need persistency in prayer? Christ said, ask, seek, and knock. But it's not just ask, seek, and knock. It's the idea of continuous action. We need to persist in our asking. We need to be persistent in our knocking. We need to be persistent in our seeking. Because if we do that, the door shall be opened unto us. And certainly this is a principle that's taught in several parables. Luke chapter 18, the parable of the persistent widow. And it's specifically stated in verse number 1 that Christ gave this parable to teach that men ought always to pray and to not give up. And so we should not give up in prayer. We need to persist. And of course, back in Luke chapter 11, he gave the parable of the friend at midnight, to teach about this need for persistency in prayer. Unfortunately, we understand, and I'm sure we all know, dear brothers and sisters in Christ, who, when faced with challenges or difficulties, were unable to persist with and in their faith. And they've turned away from God for a variety of reasons. And that's what makes this study this morning so important. Because the miracle of our study today, and as we approach Matthew 15 and Mark chapter 7 now, involves a woman. Not just any woman, but a woman who was of the same general background as the centurion last week, a Gentile. But we see a Gentile woman that was persistent. And in turn, we're going to find that she was rewarded for her persistence. And so there's some great lessons we can learn from this woman. And so today, as we continue on in our study of the miracles of Jesus, and as we consider the characteristics of faith, and in particular this morning, the need for persistence, I want us to consider the actions of this Syro-Phoenician woman as she is identified in Mark's account in Mark chapter 7. And we're going to examine this miracle that Christ performed in healing this woman's daughter, and why he performed it. We're going to look at the kind of faith that was manifested by this woman. And we're going to show that another characteristic of true faith in God is that which is persistent. And as Rusty defined it, is that which keeps on, that never gives up, that overcomes adversity. It is this faith, as demonstrated by the woman, that definitely pleases God and that will be rewarded by God. And so as we come to our study this morning, let's first of all consider the place in which this occurs, and that was in the region of Phoenicia. In verse 21 of Matthew's account of chapter 15 of this miracle, we're told that Jesus went thence and departed into the coasts of Tyre and Sidon. Now this occurs immediately after the events of verses 1 through 20, and also in verses 1 through 23 of Mark's account. Here Christ exposed once again the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, and we're not going to get into this. We don't have the time at this juncture, but obviously we're very familiar with this section of Scripture. You know, Christ was asked, "Why do thy disciples transgress the traditions of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread." And of course this sets Christ off on exposing them for what they were, for hypocrites who did worship God in vain, having taught for doctrines the commandments of men. It was after this confrontation that Christ left the area for a time. And we're told here that the travel took Christ and his disciples to the coast of Tyre and Sidon. These were Mediterranean coastal cities. Tyre was located about 35 miles north of Mount Carmel, and Sidon 20 miles north of Tyre. Both cities were located in the province of Phoenicia, which was a narrow strip of land near the northwest corner of the Mediterranean Sea. It was this part of Phoenicia, that is Syro, that was located in part of Syria. Now, these cities were very significant historically and are mentioned frequently in the Old Testament. In your study books, if you will, turn with me to page 67, and I want to read a section from the bottom of page 67 that leads us on into page 68 that helps us understand the significance of these cities, not just historically, but also scripturally. Our book records that the Phoenician cities Tyre and Sidon had been important centers of trade and commerce well before Solomon came to the throne in Israel in the 10th century before Christ. Sidon was the older city. Settlers eventually had gone some 25 miles south from Sidon to establish a colony at Tyre. The new city was situated partly on the mainland and partly on an island. In time, it surpassed its mother city in wealth and power. To the west of the Phoenician cities was the Great Sea, the Mediterranean. Directly to their east was the mighty Lebanon mountain range. The area made for a strong defensive position, but the coastal plain was narrow and infertile. The Phoenicians had turned to the sea and became sea merchants. For more than a millennium before Christ, they had left their marks on the civilizations of the Mediterranean basin and points eastward. The Greeks credited them with the invention of an alphabet, a simple but revolutionary way to keep records and to communicate. Solomon had turned to Hiram, king of Tyre, for technical assistance and supplies for the temple at Jerusalem, and Hiram had turned to Solomon for wheat and produce. 1 Kings 5, verses 10 through 12, 1 Kings 7, verses 12 through 46. The two regions, Phoenicia and Israel, were natural trading partners. So these two cities are mentioned in the scriptures, and there is that historical connection between Israel and Phoenicia. But even more interesting to note that this was only the second and the last time recorded that Jesus was in a foreign country. Does anyone remember when the first time Jesus was outside the region of Galilee, the Galilean region? Well, Samaria, but that, in a sense, that was part of Israel. But we're talking about being out of the region in general. Thought question here. First time was when he was as a baby. To escape the murderous Herod, the angel told Joseph to take the baby Jesus into Egypt. And it was from Egypt that Joseph, Mary, and baby Jesus entered into Nazareth. Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Interestingly enough, as it relates to our class on Wednesday night, that fulfilled the prophecy of Hosea in Hosea chapter 11, verse number 1, when God through the prophet said, I've called my son out of Egypt. In a sense, it related to God calling Israel out of Egypt, but in the greater sense, it refers to Christ having escaped into Egypt and coming out as a baby coming into Nazareth. And we'll discuss that more later on. The purpose for him traveling, however, was to get away from everything for a time. And as I put this together, I found this quote by McGarvey and Pendleton in the Fourfold Gospel interesting. They note that he withdrew to escape the opposition of his enemies in the mistaken movements of his friends. As he was not on a missionary tour, it was perfectly proper for him to enter heathen territory. R.C. Foster notes in his Life of Christ that this withdrawal was also in order to gain time for rest and instruction. It's also interesting as we look at these texts that Christ went away and he did not want any man to know it. But what does the Bible teach us? He could not be hid. So even when he wanted to get away and when he didn't want anyone to know it, people found him out, did they not? Foster notes that regarding this statement that his fame was too great, his personality was too compelling, his love was unfailing for others to stay away. And again, one reason he could not be hid is because of a woman that we are introduced to. And so as we think about the people of the miracle, there's two in particular, the woman and her daughter. Let's first consider the woman. In Mark's account in verse number 26, she is identified as a Greek. Now we also see this term throughout in Romans chapter 1 verse 16, but what is the term Greek a reference to? Gentile. That's exactly right, Rusty. So she is a Gentile. She's also identified as being Syro-Phoenician. Mark's description here gives us definitive information as to her race and geographical home. Matthew's account identifies her as being a woman of Canaan, and he emphasizes her pagan ancestry, which reached back to the original inhabitants of the region of Canaan. These accounts make it clear that she was of a different nationality than Jesus, who was a Jew. And I say all that to say this. How did the Jews view those of different races?
They were lower than them.
So the Jews demonstrated prejudice, did they not, toward those who were not a Jew?
They had the name for Gentiles as Goyim, which is to say cattle or something like. They were just, second-class citizens.
Exactly. The Jews treated them worse than second-class citizens, did they not? And with prejudicial contempt. And again, unfortunately, the same mindset still prevails today, does it not, in the hearts of men? Racism is a very, very sorry disposition, is it not? Because Paul told those on Mars Hill there in Acts 17 at Athens that God made all mankind of what? One race. Exactly right, Dusty. We might look different. We might be of different backgrounds, but we all bleed. We all bleed the same way. We all have blood running through our veins, and we all were created by the one God. So we're not that different at all. The Jews would have nothing to do with individuals such as these, which in turn makes it ironic, does it not, after we studied the events with the centurion, who is also a Gentile, but yet some of those Jews would have something to do with him. Why do you think that was? Well, he benefited them. He built them a synagogue, and we talked about his benevolent spirit last week. So they would use him. He did good to them. But I think it's also important to note as we look at this event, Jesus is again going to rise above the racial, the ethnicity barriers in his dealing with this woman. And again, if these Jewish religious leaders had seen what Jesus does, do you think they would have howled? Do you think they would have had something to say to Jesus? Oh, no doubt about that. So we're going to see some powerful lessons on the part of Jesus here in dealing with this woman. And we learn about her daughter. She is identified in verse 22 as being young. And we're not sure how old she is. She is other than what the text describes here. The ASV renders the word as little, which is a term used often to indicate affection. So she loved her daughter very, very much. And certainly she was very concerned, as any parent would be, over her daughter's illness. Now let's look at her plea in verse number 22, and as well as verse 24 of Mark 7 and verse 26. And again, we understand her affliction, her daughter's affliction. She was possessed with an unclean spirit, a demon, a devil. And so this Syro-Phoenician woman cries out for mercy. "O Lord, have mercy on me, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with a devil." Notice how she refers to Christ. "Lord, thou son of David." Now, what's the significance of that ascription, son of David?
He's a Jew.
Well, he is a Jew, obviously. What else?
The prophecy said it would be a son of David.
Fulfillment of prophecy. It's an ascription to Christ, as seen in the Old Testament. And again, Christ posed that question in Matthew 22. "What think ye of Christ? Whose son is he?" And of course, they said the son of David. And again, remember, David called him, Lord as well in the Psalms. So it's denoting his Jewish lineage, but also the fact that he is the Christ. What does this woman saying this about Jesus reveal about her?
Faith.
Faith, exactly right, Ricky. It demonstrates that the hopes, that the Jewish hopes had spread to the nations around about them, and that some, like this woman, had heard about the Christ and the blessings that would come through him. And her use of the title gives us certainty that she was indeed hailing Jesus as the anointed one of God, the one sent from God. And certainly we see a strong faith in this woman as evidenced by this confession. And certainly it's attested to her plea to him. She turned to the right source, did she not? Does this not reveal that at some point she had heard about Jesus? And she had heard about the mighty deeds that he had done. And certainly based upon her hearing the evidence, she believed it. And that's how she knew him as the Christ, and that's how she knew that he could cast a demon out of her daughter. Now let's look at how Christ responds here. Verse number 23, the provocation. He answered her not a word. Why do you think Christ did not say a word to her at this juncture? Because we understand, and even when Christ does say something here, it's not going to be out of contempt, as it would be on the case of the Jews. Because being God, we understand he would not view such people thusly. So why do you think he remained silent here?
Test her to see.
That's a test of faith, Rusty. So how would you feel, how would I feel if we did not receive an answer? What would we do? Would we give up?
I'd probably feel sorry for myself and walk off.
Well, there you go. There you go. I think a lot of us would at times. But again, as we think about this test here, let's think about some applications regarding prayer. And as we've already alluded to, do we just quit praying if our prayers are not answered the way we want them to be answered? No. Because as we pointed out earlier, what did the friend at midnight do when his friend who was asleep would not come to the door initially? He kept knocking. And that persistent widow there in Luke 18, when the judge would not grant her request, what would she do? She kept asking. She kept persisting. She kept, as it were, bugging him, as it were.
Well, how many times is it over if we pray?
Time and again. Our perfect example, that's exactly right, Ricky. And again. And so verse 8 of Luke 18, Christ says, when the Son of Man comes again, shall he find faith on earth? When our faith is tested, are we going to give up or are we going to persist? That's what you and I have to ask ourselves. You think about what Paul wrote as well in Galatians chapter 6 in verse number 9. He tells us not be weary in well-doing because we're going to reap if we don't what? If we don't faint. And literally that means if we don't give up. You know, we wait on the Lord, Isaiah 40 verse 31. I remember, this may be before your time, Rusty. This was early 90s, which I'm pretty sure it's way before your time. Tells you how, I'm young, but it's still, man, it doesn't seem like, former NC State basketball coach Jim Valvano, whose image will forever be associated with the NCAA basketball tournament when his underdog North Carolina State team in 1983 upset the Houston Cougars of Akeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler. And after they won the game, an image is shown of Valvano just running around the court, just being joyful. And but later on, he was diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer, about 92, 93. At the first ESPN ESPY Awards, he gave a speech. And as it related to his battle with cancer, he uttered these words that I think certainly have an application to our faith today. He stood up there and he told the audience, don't give up. Don't ever give up. And if you ever get a chance to see that speech, it will bring chills down your spine, bring tears to your eyes even.
There's a 30 for 30 on that.
Mm-hmm.
There's ESPN 30 for 30.
Yeah, but the words are appropriate for today, are they not? There's a great application for us to not give up as Christians. You don't give up. You don't ever give up. And that speech resonates with me. And so we should never give up. However, as we look at this verse as well, here in Matthew 15, his disciples came and besought him, saying, send her away, for she's crying after us. Now, Mark's account tells us that Jesus was in a disciple's house, but this idea here in verse 23, crying after us, indicates Jesus had left that house and that he and his disciples were being followed by this woman. Well, that's some persistence, is it not? And it appears the disciples wanted Jesus to help her, not out of compassion and mercy, but simply to be rid of her as she was viewed by them as a nuisance. Get rid of her, Lord. Just do whatever she asks you to do so we can be rid of her. Foster notes that how long her appeals continued, we do not know, but it was a sufficient length of time that it got on the nerves of the apostles. And so what was this woman doing? Jesus didn't tell her a word, and so Jesus sort of walks away. And so what does this woman decide to do?
Follow him.
Follow him. This is faith, is it not? This is a faith that is persistent. And notice verse 25, she prostrates herself before Christ. She worshiped him. And so what does this tell us about this woman? What does this act of worshiping him reveal about her?
That she knows who he is, that she respects who he is.
Exactly right, Rusty. Another demonstration of her faith. And what does she tell Christ in this act of worshiping him? Lord, help me. And again, we understand the term Lord denotes authority, power. So she is appealing to him as the authority. She's saying, look, I see your authority. I accept your authority. Please, I beseech you, help me. I think it's fascinating to see that her faith led her to Christ. But not only did it lead her to Christ, her faith led her to making the request for him to heal her daughter. And when she received not a word from Christ, her faith led her to worship him. Sort of seeing a progression in faith, are we not? We're seeing a faith that's not going to allow her to quit. And so let's now look at verse 26 and 26. What does Christ tell her? Someone read these words for us.
It is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs.
Question, was Christ showing contempt for this woman here?
Now he's testing her.
Testing her. Not meet is the idea of fitting or becoming. Children is reference to the Jews who were God's special people at the time, obviously. The word first here, McGarvey and Pendleton state that by using this word, Jesus suggests there would come a time there would be mercy for the Gentiles. Mark's account reads, let the children first be filled, indicates Jews first, then the Gentiles. To whom was the gospel first taken to? Jews, and then to the Gentiles, beginning in Acts chapter 10 when Peter was sent to Cornelius' household. So we see that this would be fulfilled.
Now, being the student of human nature that we all are, I might have took offense to what Jesus, said.
I think we all would have. Because especially the terminology he uses. Now, dogs here, he's not referring to her in the sense that the Jews referred to the Gentiles as dogs. They viewed them as wild scavengers. The word here literally is a diminutive, which means a puppy. And so Jesus was not sharing the same Jewish prejudice as against the Gentiles as those religious leaders did. And many commentators suggest that this was an insult. But again, this cannot be the case because we understand, would Jesus ever stoop to insulting people? No. His usage of figurative terms was to get his hearers to think, to consider what he was actually saying. And again, as you pointed out, Rusty, here his words were designed to prompt a response on her part, to see how she would react, to see how her faith would react. And hence, notice verse 27. What does she tell Jesus here? How does she react?
Yet did not the dogs eat of the crumbs that fall from the master's table?
But the first word she says to him is what? Truth. So she acknowledged this. Again, what enabled her to see this?
Her faith.
Her faith. She agreed with the basic sentiment expressed given here. She notes, however, it is also true that the dogs, and here I think we find her great humility, do we not? She willingly acknowledges herself as one, and again, takes great humility to do so. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And I think we see that this woman was poor in spirit. She is indicating but she does that, but she also says they are allowed to eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. She is indicating by her words that Jesus' ability to remove the demon from her daughter would be a crumb and not the full meal. That would just be a morsel. That would not be the whole meal. That would just be a morsel of that. That would be a crumb, and that crumb would be greatly appreciated. Her faith does not waver because by her word she still hails him as Lord. And she does refer to him here again as Lord. And master of all who can provide. Her faith is certainly seen in her humble statement of recognizance, but also in her desire to be blessed if but with a crumb. Now Christ has tested her faith. Her faith has been put to the test, put to the limit. First of all, when Christ didn't say a word to her and in essence walked away from her. And when Christ gave these words to her. Now look at the profitability of faith. And I think at times we look at faith and we forget just how profitable it is to us. How does Christ respond to her in verse 28 of Matthew 15? That's exactly right, Sister Ruby. O woman, great is thy faith. Wouldn't we like Jesus to commend us thusly? To have a great faith. Interestingly, 2 times in the gospel accounts it is recorded of Jesus commending one for their great faith. Who were they? Who was the other one besides this woman? This one's an easy question. Exactly right, Dusty, the centurion. Now what makes it even more interesting? What was their nationality? They were both Gentiles.
Such faith is not found in Israel, is what he said of the centurion.
Exactly right, Rusty.
Well, look at it today. It's the Gentiles that are Christians. The Jews still gave, most of them gave themselves as Jews.
Yeah. Exactly right. And even though, Jews today really can't prove they're Jews because all the genealogies were destroyed when Jerusalem was destroyed there at the hands of the Roman armies in AD 70. But that's exactly right, Dusty. And in fact, you look at the gospel being carried to the Gentiles in the book of Acts, and how did the Gentiles respond to the preaching of the gospel? They accepted it. And so the book of Acts clearly demonstrates that. So Christ commends the woman for her faith, and then what does he tell her? Your daughter's going to be healed. Mark's account tells us the devil is gone out of thy daughter. So what did Christ do for her faith? So what did faith do for this woman? Brought her a reward, brought her a great blessing, brought her daughter's health back. And again, Hebrews 11 and verse number 6. Without faith it's impossible to please God, but because they who cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Can we say that this woman was a diligent seeker?
Well, she didn't give up, so.
She didn't give up. And that's why I say, we can learn a lot from this woman today, can we not? About just persisting in our faith. And again, her faith was rewarded. However, let's consider this. What happened if, upon hearing Christ not even saying a word to her, what would have happened if she gave up there and said, well, he's not interested in me. He didn't say anything to me. Her daughter wouldn't have been healed. Or what if it was the case that she heard Christ's words here and just decided, I'm not going to take this from him. Her daughter wouldn't have been healed.
I think it goes back to he knew her heart. He knew how she was going to reply.
Mm-hmm.
It's made more honor and glory to his name.
Exactly. That's a great point, Ricky. The tests of faith, and her faith passed with, we might call it, flying colors. What can faith do for us? Well, I think it's seen I think the Syro-Phoenician woman exemplifies the power of true faith in God. It demonstrates certainly the importance, the necessity, and profitability of a faith that is persistent. And so, as we close, the actions of this woman certainly demonstrate this great faith, but they also demonstrate to us this need for having a strong and persistent faith. She didn't give up when Christ seemingly ignored her. She didn't give up when Christ seemingly insulted her, when in that reality it wasn't an insult. But yet, how many of us today would have taken that as an insult? But she kept on demonstrating a strong faith in him, manifested by her just persistently following him, much to the chagrin of his disciples, in responding by faith to the words he spoke to her. Warren Wiersbe notes in his commentary that this woman's faith was great because she persisted in asking and trusting when everything seemed against her. Certainly her race was against her. She was a Gentile. Her sex was against her, for most Jewish rabbis paid little attention to women. It seemed that the disciples were against her, and Christ's words might have led her to believe that even he was against her. All of these obstacles only made her persist in asking. Great lesson for us today as Christians. When everything seems against us, are we going to persist? Are we going to keep on keeping on? So just as this Syro-Phoenician woman clung very closely to Jesus by her persistent faith in him, may our faith demonstrate us to be doing likewise.